In a world where power bends the rules, and skin color still writes your story before you ever speak, one man stood between a lie and the truth. He was supposed to be the villain. Framed. Accused. Discredited. But what they didn't know, was that he'd written the book on justice. Literally. When a billionaire tries to rewrite reality, only one voice stands tall enough to bring it all crashing down. This is not just a courtroom drama. It's a story about race, reputation, and revenge served the smart way, through the law. The rain fell in narrow silver needles, slicing through the humid air that clung to the night like breath on glass. New Babylon, a gentrified phoenix risen from the ashes of forgotten neighborhoods on the east side of Manhattan, buzzed with life. Electric cars glided over wet pavement. Neon advertisements projected mid-air, promising salvation in the form of luxury smart condos and vitamin-infused coffee. But above it all, in the shimmering heights of the Arcadia Spire, the tallest residential building in the city, something unspeakable had just occurred. Richard Vale Cole III stood alone in his penthouse living room, breath sharp, heartbeat pounding like a war drum in his ears. He was dressed in a deep burgundy velvet blazer, its sleeve now smeared with a streak of blood. In his left hand, he gripped a cast-iron fireplace poker, the end of it glinting crimson under the soft lights of a $1 million chandelier imported from Vienna. At his feet lay Trenton Barlow, a venture capitalist with eyes like shark glass and a voice made of threats. Or rather, he had a voice, before it was silenced by the blunt force of a rich man's panic. Trenton had cornered Richard an hour ago, armed with documents that could dismantle the entire coal empire. Embezzlement. Land theft. Bribed council members. Offshore laundering. Richard had tried charm, threats, even cash. But Trenton wanted exposure. Justice. And now Trenton was unconscious, possibly dead. Richard stared at the body. His world spun. His empire, built on whispers, loopholes, and legacy, trembled. His father's ghost echoed in his head, "Don't get caught. Control the story." He moved quickly, cleaning the poker, adjusting his tie. Then he accessed the building's surveillance system through a panel near the kitchen. The software blinked alive. He rewound the security footage, scanning the lobby cam feed. And then, like a devil's gift, he saw him. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, late 30s, dark skin, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray three-piece suit. He'd entered the building earlier for a legal consultation with one of the tower's residents, then exited 20 minutes ago. Cassian Myles. Richard didn't know the man personally. But he recognized the name. Cassian was a well-known defense attorney. Respected. Unrelenting. A man who'd overturned wrongful convictions and made police corruption cases tremble in courtrooms. But to Richard, he was something else entirely in this moment, a scapegoat. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. "Emergency services, what's your emergency?" the operator asked. "This is Richard Cole. I've been assaulted. A man came into my home. My associate is badly injured. I think he's unconscious. You need to send help. Please, hurry. Can you describe the assailant?" Richard paused for a heartbeat, just enough to make the lie feel real. A black man. Late 30s. Very well dressed. He was wearing a suit. He looked expensive. But dangerous. He ran out a few minutes ago. It was the kind of call dispatchers were trained to respond to immediately. Within 20 minutes, New Babylon PD drones hovered around the Arcadia Spire. Officers poured into the building like blue thunderclouds. Facial recognition software worked quickly. It matched the exiting figure with a legal database entry. Cassian Xavier Myles. Defense attorney. Licensed. No criminal record. And yet, by 11:42 p.m., Cassian's name was flagged. By midnight, he was in custody. Cassian was at home in a modest but elegant brownstone on 114th and Avalon. His home was stacked with books, legal journals, and warm jazz drifting through vintage speakers. He'd just finished a virtual deposition for an immigration client when his phone buzzed. It was his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Naya Rosario. "Cassian," she whispered, panic in her voice. "There are police downstairs. A lot of them. Looking for someone." Seconds later came the knock, heavy, unrelenting. Not the kind that asks for permission. The kind that demands control. Cassian opened the door, and there they stood. Two officers in full armor, a hovering drone recording everything behind them. "Mr. Myles?" the taller one asked. "Yes. Can I help you?" "You're under arrest for suspicion of aggravated assault and attempted murder." Cassian blinked. "What?" "You have the right to remain silent." The words blurred. His heart thudded. As they cuffed him, neighbors emerged from doors, peeking out through windows. His identity, respected, earned, began to collapse before him. In seconds, he was a criminal in the eyes of his community. At the station, they questioned him. Repeatedly. The questions weren't about the truth. They were about fitting him into a narrative. "You were in Arcadia Spire tonight?" "Yes." "What was your business?" "A consultation with a tenant, a woman being evicted unfairly." "Did you encounter Richard Cole?" "No." "Did you see Trenton Barlow?" "No." "And yet, Mr. Cole says you attacked him. We have footage of you in the building." "I was never in his apartment." "Check the logs." "We're still reviewing them." But Cassian knew the game. He saw the smirk on the officer's face, the satisfaction of an open and shut arrest. And he knew who Richard Cole was. He also knew what a man like Cole would do to protect his dynasty. They locked him in a holding cell overnight. No bail. A special request from concerned high-profile parties. But Cassian wasn't broken. As the door closed behind him, he sat calmly on the bench, closed his eyes, and smiled faintly. He had seen injustice before. But this time, it was personal. And Cassian Myles had no intention of letting the story end here. The walls of the holding cell were painted a pale institutional gray, but it wasn't the kind of gray that invited calm. It was sterile, oppressive, like the waiting room of a place where time didn't move forward. Cassian sat on the concrete bench, still dressed in his suit, now wrinkled and scuffed. His tie had been removed. His belt too. Yet he held on to his posture like armor. He didn't lean. He didn't slouch. He observed. 3 hours passed. Then 4. The fluorescent lights buzzed like gnats over a field of unease. The silence was occasionally broken by officers laughing down the hall, or the heavy clank of steel doors locking. At 5:23 a.m., the cell door creaked open. A detective stepped in, a man in his mid-40s with a round gut, a tan trench coat, and eyes that had long stopped believing in justice. "Mr. Myles," he began, flipping through a file, "I'm Detective Glenn Withers. You've had quite the night." Cassian didn't reply. He just waited. The detective stepped inside, shut the door behind him, and sat on the opposite bench. "You know," Withers said, "most people in your position are either crying, denying, or bargaining. But you're just watching." "Observing," Cassian corrected. Withers smirked. "Right. You attorneys are always so clinical. Look, I'll be straight with you. The victim, Barlow, is in a coma. Head trauma. No security footage from inside Cole's apartment. Just a broken poker and one very shaken billionaire who says you attacked him and his guest." Cassian studied the detective's tone. Not aggressive. Not accusatory. But not neutral either. Controlled. Like he wanted Cassian to hang himself politely. "You've got me on video in the building," Cassian said. But not in the apartment. Not on that floor. Withers raised an eyebrow. How would you know that if you weren't there? Cassian met his gaze. Because I've reviewed security cases like this 100 times. Because I've defended men who were thrown into cells with less evidence than what you've got. Because I've been studying systems like yours since I was 17. Silence fell. I was on the 38th floor, Cassian continued. My client, Malika Thorne, is facing a wrongful eviction orchestrated by one of Cole's shell companies. I left her unit at 9:42 p.m. You can check the guest logs. The concierge AI logs timestamps. I exited the building at 9:47. That's 25 minutes before Cole made his emergency call. Withers didn't move. He just tapped the file. Sounds convenient. No, Cassian replied. It sounds like the truth. The detective stood. Well, you'll get your chance to say that in court. Outside the precinct, the media had arrived by morning. News choppers hovered above like vultures. Headlines ran on the bottom of holoscreens projected onto news drones. Celebrity attorney arrested in brutal attack on billionaire's guest. From defender to defendant, Myles faces charges. Race, power, and violence in New Babylon's elite towers. In a small cafe across town, a woman watched the news unfold on a wall screen. Her name was Malika Thorne, the woman Cassian had met just hours earlier. She was still in her bathrobe, hands shaking as she sipped coffee. Her eviction case had just become part of a citywide scandal. Cassian was here, she whispered, staring at the screen. He left before 10. No way he could have hurt anyone after that. Her cousin, Omar, glanced up from his phone. You should talk to the police. She hesitated. You think they'll listen to me? A woman fighting eviction. Against Richard Cole. They have to. Malika set her mug down. No. They don't. But I'm going to speak anyway. Meanwhile, in a dark corner office of the Arcadia Spire, Richard Cole watched the news unfold like a conductor watching his orchestra perform. His lawyer, Merrick Loam, a silver-tongued man with impeccable suits and no moral compass, stood beside him. You sure you want to keep pushing this narrative? Merrick asked. What if this guy digs back? What if his legal team finds holes? Richard stared out the window, the city beneath him like a glittering lie. There are no holes, he replied. I control the narrative. I've done it my entire life. Merrick sighed. Okay. But let me remind you, this guy isn't some street criminal. He's a legal sniper. If he figures out you framed him. He won't, Richard cut in. Because by the time he starts pulling threads, the public will have already made up their minds. I don't need to be right. I just need to be first. By the afternoon, Cassian was released under conditions of house arrest, GPS ankle monitor, no contact with alleged victims or witnesses, and a gag order. The city was split. Some believed he was a predator in a tailored suit. Others smelled something rotten in the case. Cassian returned home to find dozens of reporters outside. He said nothing. Just walked past them, into the building, up the stairs, and into his apartment. The door closed. Silence. But not for long. Because Cassian Myles was many things. And silent wasn't one of them. That evening, in his office, he called in his most trusted ally, Ilara Quinn, a private investigator with a photographic memory, a motorcycle louder than a thunderstorm, and a gift for finding the invisible. She arrived in a leather jacket, a scowl, and a paper bag full of fried chicken. You're officially interesting again, she said, setting down the food. Cassian smiled faintly. I need everything. Floor plans. Elevator logs. Concierge AI data. And find out who scrubbed the 42nd floor footage. Already ahead of you, Ilara said, pulling out a slim tablet. The building's AI system had a security override key used around 10:03 p.m., right after you left. Guess who owns that override? Cassian raised an eyebrow. Richard Cole. Elara nodded. He erased something. I'll find out what. Cassian leaned back in his chair, voice cold and steady. Good. Because he started this war. And you're going to finish it? No, Cassian said, standing. I'm going to bury him with it. By the time the sun set over New Babylon the following day, the city had turned into a courtroom of public opinion. Every podcast, live stream, and subway screen debated one thing, whether Cassian Myles, the so-called justice architect, had finally shown his true face. There were theories, heated debates, and TikToks with amateur lip readers trying to decode his expression from the viral footage of his arrest. But inside a dusty storage unit on the industrial edge of Queens, Cassian and Elara Quinn were busy doing what no one else had time for, following the truth. I pulled the override logs, Elara said, kneeling beside a server terminal humming in the darkness. Her flashlight flickered over a stack of encrypted hard drives. Turns out Richard Cole accessed the building's internal system using a master clearance key labeled Seraphim P3. That's not even standard issue. That's a classified layer of access. Cassian stood nearby, arms crossed. Let me guess. No record of what he deleted? Worse, Elara said, pushing her dark curls behind her ear. He didn't just delete it, he diverted it. The camera feed from his apartment's floor was rerouted to a dummy server. Where is it? She smirked. You're standing in front of it. Cassian blinked. You broke into Cole's off-site storage. I prefer, liberated temporarily. He let out a quiet chuckle, the first sign of light in days. The footage took hours to decrypt. Elara sat with her legs folded under her, typing as though trying to solve a Rubik's Cube with lightning. When the screen finally blinked to life, the timestamp read, 10:08 p.m., 42nd floor, Arcadia Spire. They watched. First, there was silence. The hallway camera showed nothing unusual. Then Trenton Barlow appeared, staggering toward the elevator with a bloody cloth pressed to his temple. Wait, Cassian leaned in. He was alive. More than that, Elara said, fast-forwarding. At 10:12 p.m., Richard Cole stepped into the frame, poker in hand, and looked straight into the lens. Then, with deliberate calculation, he walked over to the wall console and disabled the feed. That was the last second of video. That's enough, Cassian whispered. Barlow was conscious. That destroys the timeline of Cole's 911 call. He said I had already fled. But this proves Trenton was still moving. Elara cracked her knuckles. So what's the play? You dropped this on the press? No, Cassian said. Cole plays with public opinion. I deal in courtrooms. We wait. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard Cole sat in a private lounge atop the Obelisk Club, an invitation-only haven for New Babylon's most powerful. He sipped on a glass of rare Armagnac while Merrick Loam read aloud the latest updates. Cassian's out. But quiet. Not doing interviews. Good, Richard said. Not necessarily. When someone like him goes quiet, they're planning. Richard stared at the skyline, golden and quiet beyond the glass. Then we stay ahead. Schedule an interview. Something humanizing. I'll donate to a hospital. Kiss a baby. You know the playbook. Merrick hesitated. There's chatter. Internal whispers that Barlow might wake up. Richard's jaw tightened. Then we pray he doesn't. Merrick leaned in. Or you ensure he doesn't remember. Richard gave him a long, heavy look. Handle it. 2 days later, Cassian stood in a New Babylon courtroom during his preliminary hearing. The judge, Honorable Isla Ventnor, presided with an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else but here. Across from Cassian, Richard Cole sat with Merrick Loam, both appearing polished, calm, and confident. The prosecution began. Assistant District Attorney Callan Royce stood and delivered the narrative like he was reading from a script written by Public Outrage. The evidence is clear. Mr. Myles was in the building. He matches the description given by the victim. No alibi for the time of the attack. His professional credibility should not shield him from accountability. Cassian leaned over to his own counsel, a quiet man named Ellison Graves, and whispered, "Time to shift the balance." Ellison stood. "Your Honor, the defense moves to introduce supplemental video evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's timeline." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Ellison pressed a button. On the screen behind them, the footage from Alara's decrypted drive played. The courtroom fell into silence. Trenton Barlow, bleeding but upright. Richard Cole, alive and calm. The tampering. Even Judge Ventnor sat up straighter. ADA Royce cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this footage has not been verified." Cassian stood. "It was pulled directly from a concealed server located in a warehouse leased under one of Mr. Cole's offshore entities, Benvardi Logistics. It contains metadata that matches the security system used in Arcadia Spire. We welcome a full forensic analysis." The judge looked to Royce. "Counselor, I trust you'll arrange for that." Royce nodded reluctantly. Cassian stepped forward. "I also request Trenton Barlow be called as a witness the moment he regains consciousness. His testimony could determine whether this entire case is built on a fabrication." Judge Ventnor paused. Motion granted. Richard Cole's knuckles turned white around the arm of his chair. Later that night, Merrick slammed the door behind him in Cole's penthouse. "You arrogant fool," he hissed. "He's got you. That footage, if it's authenticated, you're finished." "I can bury it," Richard said, pacing. "By the judge." "Threaten the witness." "Do whatever we need." "No, Richard. Not this time. You went too far." "Then get out," Richard snapped. "If you can't stomach it, you're of no use to me." Merrick left. And Richard stood alone in the high-rise palace he'd built, the city blinking below like the last lights of a sinking ship. Across the city, Cassian stared out of his apartment window. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't triumphant. He was tired. Worn. But focused. "Alara," he said quietly, phone to his ear. "If Cole tries to silence Barlow, we need to be there first." "You think he'll go that far?" Cassian nodded to himself. "He already has." The beeping machines were the only sound in room 12A of New Babylon General. Soft, rhythmic, like a synthetic heartbeat. Trenton Barlow lay motionless in the hospital bed, tubes snaking from his arms, bandages still fresh around his temple. The city outside buzzed with chaos, but inside these four walls, time stood still. Until his eyes opened. At first, just a flicker. Then focus. Then confusion. A nurse glanced over and gasped. "Doctor. He's awake." By the time the news reached Cassian, he was already halfway to the hospital. Alara drove, the engine of her battered old motorcycle screaming down the expressway. "You sure this isn't a trap?" she yelled over the wind. Cassian leaned forward. "If he's awake, we don't wait. Every second gives Cole time to react." Alara smirked. "I've got your back, counselor." They arrived 20 minutes later, but they weren't alone. A black car with diplomatic plates was parked outside the emergency entrance. Cassian's heart sank. Cole had gotten here first. Inside, a hospital security guard, Officer Lohman, stepped in front of them. "Mr. Myles, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Cassian remained calm. "I have court-ordered rights to speak with Mr. Barlow upon his awakening." Signed by Judge Isla Ventnor. He handed over a sealed folder. Lohman frowned, flipped through the document, and finally stepped aside. Room 12A, he said. But be careful. Someone already tried to change the medical chart. Cassian nodded. I figured they would. Trenton Barlow looked frail but alert. His eyes widened when he saw Cassian enter. You, he rasped. They said, you did this. I didn't, Cassian said softly. And I think deep down, you know that. Barlow blinked, struggling to sit up. Cassian pulled a chair beside the bed. Tell me what happened that night, Trenton. Everything. The man hesitated, then took a trembling breath. I was invited to Cole's apartment for drinks. Said he wanted to show me a new crypto startup. Sounded fake, but the money was real. Too real. Cassian listened closely. I asked one question about the ledger's legitimacy, Barlow continued. And he snapped. Started shouting about loyalty. Said people like me don't get to ask questions. Then he hit me. Cassian's expression darkened. With what? A poker. Heavy one. Brass handle. I blacked out. You woke up in the hallway? Barlow nodded slowly. Barely made it to the elevator. He was behind me, talking to someone on the phone. Telling them to get the story right. That they had a fall guy. Cassian leaned in. That fall guy was me. Barlow closed his eyes, ashamed. I didn't know. I swear. I only remember hearing your name when I was drifting out again. Thought it didn't make sense. Cassian stood. It didn't. But you just made everything make sense. Back at Cole's penthouse, Merrick Loam stood silently, watching his former client on a private news feed. Trenton Barlow's testimony had been leaked, anonymously, and was already making the rounds. You lied, Merrick said finally. Richard Cole didn't look up. He was pouring himself a drink, hand trembling slightly. You framed an innocent man. You assaulted Barlow. And now, there's no going back. Cole looked at Merrick, glass in hand. There's always a way back. No, Merrick said. Not from this. He turned and walked out. This time, for good. Cole stood alone, surrounded by wealth that suddenly felt like a prison. The next morning, Cassian returned to court. This time, the atmosphere was different. The courtroom buzzed with reporters and legal aides. Trenton Barlow appeared via secure video feed from his hospital room, pale but resolute. I was attacked by Richard Cole, he stated, voice firm. And the man standing trial today, tried to save me. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. ADA Royce stood up. Your Honor, this new testimony completely undermines the prosecution's narrative. We respectfully request dismissal of all charges against Mr. Myles pending further investigation. Judge Ventnor looked at Cassian. Mr. Myles, do you have anything to say before I rule? Cassian stood slowly, hands clasped. Only this, power doesn't excuse cruelty. Wealth doesn't hide truth forever. And silence isn't the same as justice. The courtroom was silent. Judge Ventnor tapped her gavel. All charges against Cassian Myles are hereby dropped. This court will now open a formal inquiry into the actions of Mr. Richard Cole. Applause broke out, unprompted. Cassian didn't smile. But he did breathe. That evening, Cole tried to leave the city. His private jet, the Vesper II, sat on the tarmac at a secured airstrip. But before he could board, a convoy of black SUVs cut across the runway. FBI agents surrounded him. Richard Cole, one agent called out, badge raised. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, assault, conspiracy to commit perjury, and tampering with federal evidence. Cole's world, once an empire, shrank to the size of a pair of cold handcuffs. Ilara and Cassian stood on a rooftop in Brooklyn, watching the city breathe. You did it, she said. You beat the system. Cassian shook his head. No. I just reminded it that it exists. They stood in silence. Below, in the heart of New Babylon, sirens wailed softly. And somewhere, justice finally stirred. The trial of Richard Cole gripped the entire nation. Every news anchor had a theory. Every talk show had a segment. The story of how a billionaire tech mogul orchestrated a failed framing of a black civil rights attorney became the lightning rod for a country already burning with tension. But Cassian Myles didn't care about headlines. He cared about consequences. New Babylon Federal Courthouse was an imposing structure, dark glass, white marble, and armed guards at every entrance. Cassian entered through the east gate, flanked by Elara and his new legal team. Not because he needed them, but because this time, he was on the other side of the aisle. He was the lead prosecutor. Yes, Judge Isla Ventnor had said a week ago, arching a skeptical brow. You're asking to prosecute the man who framed you. I'm not asking, Cassian replied. I'm volunteering. No one knows this case like I do. And now here he stood. In the center of the courtroom, Richard Cole looked like a shadow of his former self. Still wearing a tailored suit, but somehow it fit wrong now, like he'd borrowed it from a stronger version of himself. His eyes were puffy, his jaw unshaven. The courtroom doors closed. The jury took their seats. Cassian stood. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice calm, smooth like jazz over granite. You've heard the headlines. The wild story of the billionaire and the bloody poker. But behind the spectacle is something simpler, and darker. A man tried to erase the truth. Tried to make the world believe a lie, because he thought his power gave him that right. He walked toward the jury box. But the truth didn't vanish. It survived in fragments, in security footage, in whispered conversations, in the bruises of a survivor. And now, piece by piece, we'll rebuild it. Together. The first days of the trial were brutal. Elara presented forensic analysis of the camera metadata. The hospital staff testified about the tampering of Trenton Barlow's medical chart, an attempt to suppress his awakening. Cassian's former co-counsel, Ellison Graves, took the stand and detailed how Cole's firm had tried to discredit them both through planted leaks. But the most devastating testimony came from Trenton himself. Now stronger, no longer afraid. I trusted him, Barlow said, voice thick with emotion. I thought he saw me as a partner. But to him, I was a pawn. When I didn't play along, he tried to erase me. He looked directly at Cole, whose gaze never rose to meet his. Cassian leaned forward. Do you believe Richard Cole intended to frame someone else for your assault? Barlow didn't hesitate. Yes. I heard him say it. What were his exact words? Barlow swallowed. We've got the scapegoat. He's perfect. They'll believe it, because of who he is. Did he mention a name? Barlow nodded slowly. Cassian Myles. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Cole finally raised his eyes, and saw the look of absolute ruin. Outside the courthouse, the city was watching. Not just New Babylon, the entire country. TikToks of courtroom sketches went viral. Young law students wore t-shirts that read, Scapegoat. Nah. Architect. Elara found herself doing interviews with major networks, explaining how digital trails work and how power hides in plain sight. And Cassian? He stayed focused. The trial climaxed with a final piece of evidence, a voice message. Cole had made one call the night of the attack to his encrypted contact system. But what he hadn't realized was that the call had been partially recorded on a redundant line by a third-party satellite failover system. The voice was grainy, but distinct. Frame him. That lawyer. Myles. The public will eat it up. Cassian played it in open court. The silence afterward felt like thunder. Closing arguments arrived like the eye of a storm. Cassian stood one final time. We are not here because Richard Cole is rich. Or because he's famous. We're here because he believed those things made him untouchable. But justice isn't a brand. It doesn't bend to money. It doesn't care about yachts or towers or tech. It cares about truth. And the truth is that this man tried to rewrite reality, and nearly got away with it. He turned toward the jury. But you're the final line. You decide whether lies win. Or whether we remind the world that even shadows can be broken by light. He sat down. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood slowly. On the count of aggravated assault, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit obstruction, guilty. On the count of malicious defamation, guilty. On the count of evidence tampering, guilty. Cassian didn't move. Richard Cole did. He lowered his head, and didn't lift it again. After the trial, Cassian visited an old neighborhood, Redwater Row, where he'd grown up. The graffiti was still on the bricks. The corner deli still had the same dusty awning. But something was different. People nodded when they saw him. Not with pity. With respect. He passed a group of kids huddled around a cracked tablet, watching a clip of his courtroom speech. One boy looked up. "That's you, right?" Cassian smiled. "Yeah. That's me." The boy grinned. "I want to be like that." Cassian crouched. "Then learn the rules. And learn how to break them, with truth." Later that night, on the rooftop of his building, Elara handed him a drink. "To justice," she said. Cassian raised his glass. "To the fight." They toasted under a sky full of city stars. And for the first time in a long time, the air felt clean. The prison that housed Richard Cole wasn't the kind seen in TV dramas. It wasn't maximum security. No razor wire fences or violent cell blocks. It was a white-collar correctional facility in Vermont, tucked between frozen hills and pine trees, the kind of place designed to look more like a retreat than a cage. But make no mistake, it was a cage. Cole sat in a common room, staring at a chessboard he hadn't moved in weeks. His fellow inmates had names like bankers, not gangsters. But none of them respected him. Not anymore. Power, once absolute, had crumbled. And far away from those cold hills, in the city that never slept quietly, New Babylon, something else was beginning. Cassian Myles stood on the steps of the New Babylon courthouse, facing a sea of reporters. Cameras clicked like machine guns. Microphones pointed like bayonets. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. Today, justice wasn't just served, it was reclaimed. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. "Mr. Myles, how does it feel to take down Richard Cole? Will you run for public office? Do you think this changes the perception of the American legal system?" He held up a hand. "I didn't take down Richard Cole," he said. "His lies did. All I did, was refuse to look away." Later that evening, in a quiet bar beneath the Manhattan Bridge, Cassian sat with Elara, Trenton Barlow, and a few other allies who had weathered the storm beside him. Barlow raised a glass. "To the man who stood when they wanted him broken." Cassian shook his head. "To the truth, the real kind. Not the kind that sells papers." They drank. The jukebox played an old Nina Simone tune. "I wish I knew how it would feel to be free." Fitting. Barlow leaned in. "You're not done, are you?" Cassian gave a soft smile. "Just getting started." The next morning, Cassian appeared before the State Judicial Board. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was applying to launch a new division within the Department of Justice, the Independent Civil Inquiry Unit, ICAU. Its purpose? Investigate high-profile cases where racial bias, corruption, or media manipulation may have skewed justice. The board looked skeptical. One commissioner, a silver-haired man with a reputation for stone-hearted rulings, asked, "Why should the state fund a unit like this? Justice already exists." Cassian responded calmly. "Justice exists the way stars exist at noon. It's always there, but sometimes you need to change the light to see it." They approved the proposal unanimously. The ICU launched 3 months later. Ilara became its lead investigator, Barlow its strategic consultant, and Cassian, its director. They didn't go after petty cases. Their work targeted the untouchables, CEOs, politicians, corrupt judges. They uncovered a pharmaceutical cover-up in Maine, exposed a false confession case in Kansas, and sued a defense contractor for silencing whistleblowers. They made enemies. But they never worked in the dark again. 1 year to the day since Richard Cole's conviction, Cassian visited his old neighborhood again. This time, he wasn't alone. A camera crew followed him for a public television documentary. But more importantly, so did a group of high school interns, all students of color from across the boroughs. Cassian walked them through Redwater Row like it was sacred ground. "This street taught me how to read people," he said. "That store over there, first place I saw someone get falsely accused. I was 8. The students listened, rapt. One girl, maybe 15, raised her hand. "How do you stay calm when it's unfair?" Cassian smiled. "I don't. I stay focused." In Vermont, Richard Cole finally agreed to an interview. Just one. A journalist named Hayes Delacroix sat across from him, recorder on the table. "Do you feel remorse?" Delacroix asked. Cole gave a bitter laugh. "I feel irrelevant." "Do you blame Myles?" Cole shook his head slowly. "No. He didn't destroy me. I built the bomb. He just read the instructions." The interview made headlines. But the world had already moved on. That night, Cassian stood on a rooftop overlooking the skyline. New Babylon pulsed like a living thing, ugly, loud, and beautiful. Ilara joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Next move?" she asked. Cassian thought for a long moment. "We build something that lasts." She raised an eyebrow. "More speeches?" He chuckled. "Less talking. More doing." She tapped his cup. "Then here's to the work." They toasted. Below, in the tangle of streets and lights, a boy crossed the road with a folder full of law school applications. A girl walked past a billboard that read, "Truth is power. Don't let it go quiet." Years later, Cassian Myles would be remembered not just for the trial, not just for beating a system stacked against him, but for rebuilding part of it. Brick by brick. Precedent by precedent. He never became a politician. He never sought fame. But his name appeared in textbooks, in murals, in whispered stories told by kids who felt unseen, until they saw him. The shadows never disappeared. But because of him, the truth no longer hid inside them.